If Ezra wrote Chronicles, how could 2 Chronicles 5 verse 9, especially 9b, be true? Now, before we do that, if you turn there, before we answer that question, a lot of people, including myself, believe that there is evidence that Ezra wrote Chronicles. What is some of the pieces of evidence that might suggest Ezra actually wrote Chronicles? This is now, I'm going to start asking questions. Does anyone know why we think Ezra wrote Chronicles?
The ending of the book of Chronicles matches up with the start of Ezra.
Take us there, Sam. So Sam says one of the reasons why we think Ezra wrote Chronicles is in the final chapter. So if you're not totally familiar with this and where Chronicles fits, a lot of people feel that it's written by Ezra, so that would be post-exilic, so post-exile, and this is the exiles returning. So the evidence in chapter 36, Sam, is where? That Ezra possibly wrote this.
So 2 Chronicles 36, verse 22.
Good?
Through to the end, really, 23 as well.
Good? All right. Yeah, sorry, Sam.
Oh, no, that's fine. It's the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Word of the Lord comes to fulfill the prophecy of Jeremiah to the spirit of Cyrus. And he talks about how God has made him king over all the kingdoms of the earth and to build a house in Jerusalem. And you find the same thing in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 3.
Yep, good. So if you didn't get that at the back, Sam's saying that the ending of the book of Chronicles records the first year of Cyrus and the declaration to go back. That is exactly the beginning of the book of Ezra, right? So same thing. So that's evidence that maybe at least Chronicles is written around the time of Ezra and a link to Ezra himself. And of course, what was Ezra's, this is a young people person question. What was Ezra's job? What was Ezra in the scripture? Young people under 17. You did not come tonight willing to answer questions, did you? Yes, he was a scribe. Are you under 17? No, but good. So Ezra's a scribe, which then the kind of idea that he wrote Chronicles fits his job as well. Just another one. Come to 1 Chronicles chapter 9. There's quite a number. Sam's given a really clear one. The end of Chronicles ends like the book of Ezra does, and only a post-exile person could record events about Cyrus. But just have a look here too. This is in 1 Chronicles, chapter 9, verse 1. So all Israel was recorded by genealogies, and indeed they were inscribed in the book of the kings of Israel. But Judah was carried away captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. And the first inhabitants who dwelled in their possessions in the cities were Israelites, priests, Levites, and the Nethinim. Now, chapter 9 records events that happened after the exile when people started going back. So this can't be written in the time of Kings, and it's got to be written after the exiles start going back. And he records in chapter 9 some of the first people that are actually back in Jerusalem. So this puts Chronicles way back. And if you're of the mindset or possible thinking that Chronicles is just a rehash of Kings, it's definitely not, all right? There's a whole nother focus and a whole nother message in Chronicles. So let's go back to our original question, just to give context in case we're jumping in for some that didn't quite sort of see the relevance there. If Ezra wrote Chronicles, how could 2 Chronicles 5 verse 9 be true? So let's go to chapter 5 verse 9, and you'll see why the question arises. This is recording the ark being brought into the temple. So the author of Chronicles is recording something from the time of the ark being brought into the temple. And verse 6, just have a look back at verse 6 first. Also King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled before him in the ark were sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be counted or numbered. So this is the time of Solomon, that whoever's writing Chronicles is recording something that happened in Solomon's time. And then he says in verse 9, and if you remember, Uncle Steve Mansfield touched on this verse a little while ago in his exhort. The poles, verse 9, the poles extended so that the ends of the poles of the ark in the most holy place could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary. But they could not be seen from the outside, and they are there to this day. Now that is the catch, because in Ezra's time, there was no ark, and there certainly were no poles sticking out of the most holy place, right? The ark was no longer there. So the question is, how can Ezra say that they're still there today when they're definitely not in Ezra's time? Make sense? All right. So what are the possible answers? Well, possibly someone who's editing the book, like let's say, forget Ezra, someone who's editing the book over time made a mistake, or this is just pure error. Okay? And a lot of people actually take this as, so the biblical critical method of interpreting the Bible will take this as a classic mistake in the Bible of a historian putting things together using different sources and just accidentally left stuff in. So one person says it should be attributed rather to a previous editor or regarded as a complete corruption. Nice. Now, we don't take that view, so there's got to be something a little bit more profound going on, and I think there definitely is, right? But let's just look at that view for a second, because I think it's worthwhile in Bible studies, when people are, in Christadelphians as well, are interacting with commentaries that are not Christadelphian, you will find a thread or a version of commentaries that approaches the scriptures with a critical mindset. And that is not really inspirational. There's problems with the text. Some parts are accurate, some parts are not, maybe historical, maybe not. And that's fairly common out there. And this version basically sees books like Chronicles as not having an author, but it's just a compilation of a series of editors, or they call redactors, over time. And so what they would say here is that this is just the leftovers of redactors that have manipulated the book and compiled sources over time. And it's either an error or they forgot to take it out because it didn't make sense at their time. Now, I think there's a better answer to that, and one that's biblical. Perhaps the chronicler is quoting Kings, which would be a much earlier record. In fact, I think this must be close to the answer. Come, keep your hand in Chronicles. Look at 1 Kings 8. It's almost word for word. Right? 1 Kings 8, verse 8. Same time, same event, same context. You can compare them if you flip back and forth, but let's just read verse 8 of 1 Kings 8. The poles extended so that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And they are there until this day. Now that makes sense in the authorship of Kings, but the challenge is what's going on in Chronicles. And I believe one of the ways to see this is that if, let's assume it's Ezra, because I think there's ample evidence that it is, Ezra is actually using and quoting Kings as one of his sources, obviously doing that under inspiration, but he's quoting and interacting with 1 Kings chapter 8 and other elements of the King's record, but adding and under inspiration, filling out a different story and a different message for his times that's relevant. Now, there's no doubt that whoever wrote Chronicles is relying heavily on Kings under inspiration, because there's a lot of similarities to Chronicles and that 1 Kings chapter 8. There's lots. But Chronicles has its own emphasis on Levites and temple worship and all sorts of other things like prayers and speeches and exhortations. So it's very possible that Chronicles is just using Kings. But there must be a reason for that, and I think there might be. And it possibly links into the third thing that is going on here, and that is the phrase, and it's there to this day, is also possibly idiomatic for from then on, or for perpetuity, right, or for continuation. So the ark was there, and in the mind of everyone, it was going to stay that way because that was God's will, and the temple was set up. So the chronicler could be using it as like when it was set up, it was there, and from that point onward, it wasn't going to change. Now, of course, history did change it because of their unfaithfulness, which the Ezra records in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. Now, there's other uses we won't go through tonight, but Chronicles uses that phrase, and so it is today, or so it keeps going today, a number of times in Chronicles. Some of them might be literal, but you can definitely take some of them as like, and it was like that from that point forward, as an idiom, not necessarily literally that it's always going to be there to this day. So I think there's a combination going on, and I feel like there's an exhortational point as well. I feel what Ezra is doing is saying to the people, and if you're familiar with Chronicles, Chronicles is all about spiritual revival. So the exiles have come back after 70 years of captivity. There's the temples in ruins. Joshua and Zerubbabel take the first wave back, and then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And it's all about rebuilding. But if you remember the story in Ezra, the Levites are unwilling. There's very few Levites ready to get out of captivity after they've been freed to go back. Ezra really struggles to get the temple and the people and everyone going again. So I believe he writes Chronicles as a spiritual handbook to revive the people and get them back to the practices that should be back. And if you just, I'll show you why he's doing this. Come to 1 Chronicles chapter 9. You'll see evidence of this. He's all about returning the people to how it should be and how it originally was, with worship and service and honoring God, because they've gone without for so long. Right? Look at his focus in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. And he does this in Chronicles. He keeps referring back to David and Samuel. Look at verse 22. All those chosen as gatekeepers were 212, and they were recorded by their genealogy in their villages. David and Samuel, their seer, had appointed them to their trusted office. When you go through Chronicles, he keeps saying, this is what David instituted. This is how it should be. This is what we used to do, and we need to revive that when we get our unity and our spirit back in real worship. And so I believe when Chronicles writes that this is the Ark of the Covenant, and it's there until this day, it's a pointed reminder to the people of what things used to be like when things were right and when they were worshiping God in the right spirit. And it's a reminder to those reading Chronicles like, oh yeah, that's what it was, along with all these other things that Chronicles records happened in that time. And it's a revival, it's an encouragement, and it's a pricking of the conscience to stir up spiritual revival of how things ought to be and how things once were. So that's one way of looking at curious detail in the record of Chronicles.